that that sense of separate self is beginning to fall away, and it's falling away in favor of or into this overwhelming sense of allness, that it's losing its individuality, but losing it in favor of what is overwhelmingly complete.
Yes, Jonathan, thank you so much for giving us the chance to speak to you. Well, I wanted to have a chat because so you had a number of spiritually transformative experiences during your lifetime, but your main experience, if understood correctly, was an NDE at the age of 29 as a result of a surgical complications. So why don't we skip all the details leading up to the near-death experience and
Sure.
jump right in from the beginning of the experience.
All right. So that experience takes place, it's actually 7 days after that surgery. So this is not an operating table kind of near-death experience or something like that. And I was in the hospital for 4 days. I was then released into the care of my father, who just took me out to the family house and wanted to watch over me as I recovered. There was very little he could do other than, well, there's very little he could do. And the 3 days into his care, I experienced what I can best describe as simply an inner click. And in this moment of a click, it's instantly clear that the life force animating this body is beginning to drain away. The body is beginning to die. And there are three sort of recognitions that immediately flow in the moment of that click. And they all happen simultaneously, but I can only tell them one after the other. The first one is simply that I recognized immediately that I was not my body, that there was this aware consciousness, there's awareness that was aware of the body and recognizing that the body was beginning to lose its life force. But what was curious about that was that it was very clear that that aware consciousness was itself unchanged. It was not dying. It wasn't going anywhere. Wherever it was, it remained exactly as it had been. And so there was this immediate sort of difference between there's my body and there's something that still feels like me, and that one of them is beginning to die and the other one is unimpugned. It is unaffected by it entirely. And there's a particular reason why that was so powerful in that moment. And that's because I glossed over what led up to this, but this is a surgery I'd gone through that is very well known for being exceptionally, just mind-bendingly painful to recover from. And so it had been 7 straight days of absolutely, really, genuinely hell. One of the doctors had said, this is like breaking your leg and then having to walk on it for days. And that sounded dramatic, but it really proved to be quite accurate. So in this instant of recognizing that the body's dying, but that I am not, there's this experience of being released from that pain, because if I'm not the body, then I'm also not the pain in that body. And I don't have to identify with it. I don't have to attach to it. I don't have to tell a story about it. It actually just is irrelevant. And that's how it's experienced. And I would be clear about saying, it's not that the pain somehow went away. The pain in that body was just as present as ever. It's just that it had no meaningful effect because it wasn't me. But that still is sort of conferred this level of freedom that is, well, it can be hard to put into words, but extraordinarily freeing. And one of the ways I've often described it is that it was the first time, it was not at all the last time, but it was the first time I saw very clearly the difference between pain and suffering. So, because there was in fact still pain in that body, it's just that I wasn't suffering it in any way, not really. So if you've already, and when you've gone from something that is reasonably described as absolute hell to no suffering at all, well, you can begin to imagine the freedom that that would confer on someone. So that is the first thing that sort of floods in the moment of this click, and simultaneously also floods in a second realization, which is that the body is dying at a relatively slow rate. It's like watching mercury recede in a thermometer. And it presents itself as though this is going to take a while, and I'm going to, at least a number of days, I don't know how long, but this is not going to be a momentary experience. And with that, what was surprising about it was that that was met not with some sort of panic, like, oh my gosh, I'm dying, was not the experience of it in any way. It was the complete opposite of that. It was, this freedom is so extraordinary, and it looks like I'm going to have a few days to experience it. And that presents itself as something spectacular and glorious and remarkable, and something to be reveled in, and a great gift to be able to explore for a little while. And the third recognition that floods in the moment of this click is actually very similar to the first in a way, but it also blows away that sort of first recognition and that first experience of real freedom. It really ups the ante enormously, in that, and I have to go back to that first one for a moment. In that first recognition of I'm not the body, there's still yet this sort of separate sense of self. This aware consciousness that is recognized in the body is still non-corporeal, non-bodily, and yet it's still a separate, I don't know how else to put it. There's just it's like, there's a sense of self in it. It just isn't one that's limited by the body. But in this third recognition, it's seen that even that sense of non-corporeal self is beginning to dissolve. That sense of separate self is beginning to fall away and disappear, dissolve. It's that falling away, that dissolving is happening at precisely the same rate as the falling away of that life force. And it's falling away in favor of, or into, this overwhelming sense of allness, that individuatedness is dissolving into what is all-encompassingly whole, all-encompassingly all. It's one of those things that begins to be very difficult to put into words. It's losing its individuality, but losing it in favor of what is overwhelmingly complete. And what I would stress about that, besides being a sort of another level of freedom that presents itself as even greater than simply having relinquished any suffering, but what I would stress even more about it is that there could not possibly be any sense of loss in this. And in that sense, there couldn't possibly be any fear about it, if there's no sense of loss in any way. And it's that if something is all-encompassingly whole, all-encompassingly vast, then it's missing nothing and can't possibly be missing anything. And so it's in that sense that there could not be any sense of lack, any sense of want, or any sense of need in it. Sometimes when people have asked questions about that particular point, I've had the opportunity to say, well, it's sort of like having gone from a small point, looking up at what's vast and marveling at how vast it is, to switching places and being that vastness. Wow. That contains absolutely everything, including even the possibility of being perceived as a small point. Recognizing that small point isn't really the real truth. This vastness is what's overwhelmingly true. But it's that vastness that does, in fact, contain absolutely everything and all. And without any sense of lack in any way whatsoever, there really can't be any sense of fear. And so this is experienced, again, not as a loss of any kind, but as a just overwhelming sense of peace. It's been said many times in many different places from many different sources that that love is the opposite of fear. And that's a phrase that I'm very fond of. I'm not sure it's even inclusive enough. But certainly in the moment I'm describing, there's this sense that peacefulness, that essentially lovingness, is really the only default setting. It's the most fundamental substrate. And I say it's perhaps not even a phrase that's even quite big enough, because in that moment, it's also experienced that love really has no opposite at all. It is so all-encompassing that it doesn't really have an opposite. There's not really even an option for another thing like fear. And it's in that sense that we could say it's very whole and very one. And that is how I spent the rest of the afternoon. Occasionally my father, looks in on me. He's sort of just rummaging around the house, doing house chores and farm chores and garden chores, things like that. And again, there's really nothing he can do for me. But at this point, there's nothing, I have no sense of needing to do anything for myself either. It's really, that's really what that sense of, if there's no sense of lack or want or need, what is there to do? There's nothing that needs to be fixed. I mean, it renders the idea that the body dying could be terrible, horrible, tragic, or otherwise to be avoided as totally irrelevant. And when he comes in the room, there's no impulse in me in any way whatsoever to try to say, hey, Dad, guess what? I'm dying. Or say, a funny thing, my body and myself, two different things, and one of them is totally irrelevant. None of that even occurs. It's just, he comes into the room, and the only thing that makes any sense at all to me is to smile at him when he arrives and feel tremendously loving towards him. I'm also aware in that moment that even if I could say those things to him, they aren't things that he would have had any meaningful way of understanding. Not really. And so the impulse to communicate this was zero. The only thing that was present really was just an overwhelming sense of lovingness that made sense. And it was just simply sort of a moment of communing with him in that lovingness. And that was enough. And that's how I entered the rest of the evening as well. Having spent 7 days in really mind-bending blackout level pain meant I hadn't slept much. And as the night came, it began to seem like, well, gosh, maybe I'll actually get to sleep a little. That's probably good for this situation, good for the body. Not that it really mattered to me too much, but it sounded nice. And I did, in fact, sleep for the first time in days. And I still woke up during the night. And every time I woke up, I would check in, with this experience. Is my body still dying? Is the mercury still dropping? Yes, in fact, it's going a little faster now. I can see that sort of final endpoint, that final doorway, as it's often called, is coming a little quicker than it was before. That doesn't, again, elicit any kind of worry or concern. That's not a problem. It doesn't, but it's coming a little sooner. I wake up into the following day, and there arises this sort of question in my mind, like whether or not I am actually going to go through that doorway or not. It arises as an option, with a very clear option to decide to go through it, drop this body completely, or stay. And that begged an interesting question. I still think it's kind of an interesting question that, well, if you're experiencing something that is literally the peace that passes all understanding, all encompassing a wholeness in which, something loving and gentle is really the only default option. And that's what's presented by that doorway. Why wouldn't you go through it?
Right.
That sounds delightful. And it's a good question, and it's a reasonable choice.
So what did you come back?
Yeah, yes. Why? This place is nuts, I mean, this place is all over the map.
Yeah.
And so it really was very surprising to me that during the course of that following day, there was this thought that arose that was something like, I think I'm not done here. I think there's some things I need to do here, or that I need to or should, or something like that. It's hard to, those aren't really the exact words at the time that arose, but it was kind of a surprising point in the whole thing, in which it was presented as a choice, and that I was likely to choose to not go through that doorway, despite what it offers. And that was in part surprising, because when I thought to myself, well, what am I supposed to be doing here? I'm 29 years old. I've been trying to figure that out for quite a while. I'm a youngish guy that's trying to figure out how to make his way in the world. And I can't say I was doing an amazing job of it. It was probably pretty average, just trying to figure it out and how to do life. And I did not feel like an expert on the subject at all. And I had no idea how to answer the question of what I was supposed to be doing here. And so to be presented with that idea that I should stay because there are things to do, it was a natural thing to ask, like, all right, fine, what are they? I don't even know. I guess I'll have to find out. I guess I'll have to figure that out too. But there was it was very close. It was like, go through the doorway, great idea. Not go through the doorway, kind of compelling. I can't even figure out why. It was very close. But in the end, there was something about staying that just seemed like it made sense in a way I couldn't put my finger on. And so that was that's where I moved. And by the time that had sort of sorted itself out in this next day, as a sort of beautiful corollary to that inner decision, my father appears in the doorway, yet again, having a look to check on me. And he just, his face changes, and he looks at me a little funny and squints at me and says, Jonathan, I think something's not right. I think we're going to load up the car. We're going to head back over to the hospital. And when he says that, I think,
whatever.
Oh, all right. I guess I really am going to stay. Sure. And it sort of comes as this just a nice, like the decision had already been made, and this is what needed to follow. And so it's a 2-hour drive to the hospital, the same hospital that conducted the surgery. I'm in a terrific mood. I can barely speak. I mean, this is in a surgery that took place on the back of my throat and some various places, other places in the sinus cavities, and details not important, but so I can eke out a whispered word at best in this stage of healing. And but I'm in a great mood. I'm kind of trying to crack jokes and make my dad laugh, and I'm in a fabulous mood. The whole idea of dying as a tragedy has just gone out the window, since the previous day. And anyway, we get to the hospital. They do in fact confirm that I am dying, and I'm dying for the stupidest reason in all of medical science. I'm dying from dehydration. And so it's also a very simple fix. and where the body is shutting down from lack of water, they poke an IV bag with saline solution into my arm, and this entire process immediately begins to reverse, and I can feel that life force begin to flood back in, and I can feel that merging with the infinite begin to reverse as well. And it's just like beginning to put my feet back on the ground here a bit more. And they hold me for a few hours to make sure everything's all right, which it is. And we eventually head back over to the farmhouse later that night. And I spend the next 3 weeks recovering in a way, and that recovery speeds up very quickly and dramatically. And pretty soon I go back. Well, 3 weeks later, I go back to my own home. I go back to my job, go back to the office, and I am baffled as to how to reconcile my experience.
I bet.
Yeah, and not in a harsh way or anything like that. It's just that people would ask regularly, "Oh, I know you had a surgery. How'd it go?" "Oh my gosh, I almost died." Really? Wow, what happened? "Oh, well, the blah 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 dehydration." And I would tell the story, but I very carefully left out the parts in which myself and my body were two different things. I couldn't imagine saying it in a way that someone would meaningfully understand. Or I left out the part of merging into the infinite, never came up.
Yeah, probably wise choice.
I don't know. It was the only way I knew I could navigate it, actually. And one way of looking at the next decade, really, because I essentially spent the next decade faced with reconciling what I knew to be true, what I knew that I knew, and had experienced what I'd experienced and seen what I had seen, and that sort of thing. It's perhaps part of the reason we're here today, but it required a whole bunch of additional experiences for me to reconcile all these things in a way that I could embody what I knew to be true here in this dimension, in which all of them, in this dimension in which it seems like these bodies are very important, that they are to be guarded quite jealously, that our well-being is utterly and totally focused on this very small slice of the universe here, and that all of its wants and needs, and that the idea that there could be actually a lack of an individuated self in there in some way that makes any sense, and that in fact, as a sort of an ultimate truth, that lack of self or that lack of separation could have the deepest truth possible. It was going to take quite a while and quite a number of other experiences to have any of that make real sense in a way that could be embodied here. And that's what I spent the next decade and more kind of unpacking. But that's the gist of the whole NDE. If people have often said, well, did it change your life? Because they're assuming that it did. And in the immediate aftermath, the clear answer is no, it didn't, because I couldn't figure out. I essentially buried the experience so that I could go back into regular life in a way that wasn't totally confused. And what it did do, it was like a huge signpost. It basically shifted my own attention more from out here in the world and figuring out how to make it here to inwardly. Essentially what it did was it turned me into much more of a spiritual seeker, because I knew I had to turn inward to begin to grapple with and understand these things more. And so in a way that it was unspoken, it was extremely private. It did not in any way involve teachers or anything outward. No one would have guessed that seeking inside myself was beginning to become so ferocious, frankly. But it was, and it remained, and it only grew in that ferocity for many years. And the other thing that began to happen is just a whole range of other experiences. that maybe we'll have time to talk about or get to another time or something. But that people often speak about in these evolutions in which there are moments of experiencing being out of body. There are experiences of heightened intuitive sensibilities, and eventually a kind of a healing modality that appears eventually, and it was I didn't know this yet, but there were going to be many times coming in which I saw again the difference between pain and suffering, including on this sort of oddly grand scale, like here's my own pain and suffering, but also let's see what that's like in the context of overall, like the suffering of mankind, and things like that. But it opened up quite a journey.
Thank you so much for sharing, Jonathan. I think you touched on a lot of interesting points. What I love about your story is that you speak about, you're clearly a very good example of someone that was able to was shown the non-duality aspect of our reality. And you were given a point of reference somehow, right? So
Yes.
Obviously the problem with most of us that have not had the direct experience is that this is the only point of reference that we have. So obviously
Right.
we make do with what we've got, because we don't know any better. But what we can learn, I feel, from end the years is that, and you're the perfect example of it, is that once you come out of the body and you're able to, let's say, experience the totality of the being. You talked about the totality of the unity of it, and I'd be curious to know what was it like to then go back to this very restricted reality. Because you mentioned as well that your integration was pretty long, and PMH Atwood, she mentions that on average it takes about 7 years to integrate a realization like that. So, people assume after an experience like that you come out immediately transformed, but that's never really been the case. It takes, as you mentioned, a lot of years sometimes to try and make sense, to say, hold on, what did I just experience? Why am I still here? How can I now live this dual life with that, non-dual point of reference in mind? So I'll be curious to hear your take on this.
Well, I certainly, I agree with everything you've just said, in that, there can be, when someone has a remarkable, extraordinary, unexpected, perhaps really powerful experience, there is a way in which that mind, most of the time, it seems like it can never snap all the way back to where it was before. So is there some way in which that one seems permanently altered, at least a little bit, right from the jump, right from that occurrence? Yes. I mean, I would corroborate that in my own experience, in that, by the time I went back to work, I did know that my own mind couldn't snap all the way back, which is why it began to have this seeking, questioning, like, no, wait a minute. I know there's more to the story here. I can't figure out how to make sense out of it all, but I know there's more to the story. So in that sense, there was a permanent, if subtle, shift. But I loved the word that you used, which was integrate. Like, how, could it take 7 years or so to integrate something like that? Oh my goodness, absolutely. Absolutely. And in my own work with people, I've seen that sort of go in many, there's a wide spectrum of those things. Like there are some for whom they embark on that journey of integrating immediately and rather voraciously. And for others, it's kept very much at bay. It's kept like, I don't know how to do this, so I'm going to kind of keep it at arm's length. And there's everything in between. We all go on such remarkably individual journeys, even though from my point of view, it seems like they all eventually end up in roughly the same place.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, yeah, for me, it's, well, what would I say about it? The first thing I did was bury it in terms of really making a rather conscious choice. Like, I think I'm probably never going to talk about this to anyone. Now, I changed my mind on that over time.
You clearly did.
Yes, which I feel good about. I feel grateful for. And I don't think it would be unusual that there was going to have to be a whole bunch of other life experiences, and uh, that certainly that I went through. And I so often hesitate to figure out, like, where do I start, or how much time do we have? But the I'll just pick and choose a few little spots. But there was one of the things that began to occur for me, and this was a number of years later, was that I I connected to a couple of things very particularly. One was that tremendous sense of peace. That was something that was impossible to forget. And the background I'd come from was pretty chaotic. And again, we don't need to labor over the details at the moment, but to sort of touch that kind of peace was an incredible signpost for me. Like, I couldn't figure out how it worked, but I knew that being pointed in that direction felt right and good. And so that was a powerful, it felt as though that just being oriented towards that kind of peace probably helped me make all kinds of individual choices, some of them conscious, some of them probably rather unconscious, that would orient me towards more experiences in that direction. It's one of the things that I love about these kinds of, whether an NDE experience or other kind of transformative experience, when they so often don't cause some cataclysmic difference in someone's lives immediately, what they so often do is make this slight reorientation. There's a wonderful word it's a big word from science, the sensitive dependence on initial conditions, which is, that's so many syllables, but basically it's a fancy way of saying that thing where if you're shooting a rocket ship somewhere way out in space and you make the tiniest adjustment in its trajectory at the beginning, it ends up in a completely different part of the universe.
True.
And that's how I so often see these experiences for people, that it causes this very slight reorientation that over time begins to create a remarkable difference in terms of the kind of experiences that they're having. And so being oriented towards that peace was one way that manifested for me. And the other was that there had been, like, even as a child, I remember lying in bed at night and doing this funny thing that I just sort of played with, because I was always awake and it was dark and I wasn't allowed to get out of bed and that sort of thing. And I just had nothing to do except entertain myself with the inside of my own mind. And there was some point in there where I had this funny little awareness that there was something in my personality, that there was something sort of behind, that was the best way I could think of it, behind my personality. And I think it's the first time that in a small way I ever touched on what I referred to earlier as this sort of aware consciousness, this sort of, in spiritual circles, it's often called observer or witness consciousness. And I remember discovering that as a child, and I didn't think of it as a mystical experience or a spiritual experience. I didn't have any words like that to even wrap around it. It just was a curiosity to me that I found and would sort of toy with in my own mind. And I've often wondered if, having sort of stumbled across that experience as a 8-year-old, had some bearing on the possibility that I would experience something deeper in that way during something like an NDE. But post NDE, not only am I oriented towards that sense of peace more, but there began to be these moments in which I would sort of stumble into a moment of deep peace and began to recognize and connect the notion that there was a way in which this was a stepping back from the sort of egoic frame of reference in which that really egoic mind was always trying to drive and figure out and make things happen. And there was something that there was there was some way in which connecting to that piece also connected somehow to this sense of setting aside that egoic frame of reference. And there was sort of a period of years where I just began to sort of sometimes sort of spontaneously experience those things, but also really begin to try to pick them apart and understand them. And that brought so many other experiences my way, including some of the sort of classic ones, in terms of, having a moment of being outside the body. And I don't think any of these things are actually terribly unusual, in a way that I think they're fairly common. I think people are less likely to talk about them than they are to actually experience them.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter what form they come in, whether it's an NDE could be one form of a unusual experience. So could an out-of-body experience. So could, encountering some kind of, inner guidance of some sort, or other kinds of intuitive abilities. And what I love about all of them is that they just sort of expand people's mind to the idea that this isn't all there is, that there's more to the story, and that this particular bodily limitation isn't the whole story, and that it's sort of like their frame of reference begins to expand. And as that frame of reference expands, so those sort of limitations that we put on ourselves begins to expand, to the point that if it sort of goes kind of, well, I hesitate to say all the way, but that there can be these kinds of experiences that eventually come and begin to reveal that even that individuated sense of a personal self isn't the whole story either. Even the idea of a soul, which is a beautiful expansion of someone's limitations. Like, I'm not just a body, I'm a soul. And if I'm a soul, then all of a sudden I can transcend this physical form in some respect. And all of a sudden it might make more sense now. Oh, if I'm a soul, then I can be embodied in perhaps multiple different bodies. And all of a sudden there's this experience of multiple past lives in other bodies and things like that, or the possibility of being in other dimensions that a soul can travel to, but this physical body cannot, and that sort of thing. But so there's this great expansion of those limitations, but that even that idea of being a soul is still essentially a separation idea. It says I'm an individuated self, I just have bigger boundaries. And there can even come a point when even that sense of separation can begin to very gently be revealed to be not the whole story. Like, there's more to the story. And that even that sense of individuatedness can begin to sort of dissolve into that all-encompassingness, in which even that sense of individuation can begin to fall away a little bit. I've often had people, first of all, it's rare except in forums like this that I get to have conversations about something like the individuated sense of self could be a fiction. That just doesn't fly most of the time. Certainly not in, out and about in the regular course of daily life.
Because people are stuck in that mind frame, in that point of view. So of course it's like the two fish, they're meeting each other. Oh, did you know we're in the ocean? What are you talking about? I don't see any ocean, right? But that's because you're right in it.
Yeah. And I have a lot of, I appreciate that. That's an analogy I've heard in the past a bunch, and I love it. It's for one thing, it's kind of very sweet. In my mind, it shows up as sort of like this cartoonish picture of these two cartoon fish. Like, it's just, that's very sort of sweet. But one of the things I've encountered sometimes is people saying something like, well, the idea of losing my sense of self sounds terrifying. And my experience is that when people approach that kind of threshold, there are often fear patterns that crop up that say, and then it does feel traumatic or scary to them in some ways. And I feel like I can understand that very, very well. And it's in those moments that I just would hasten to support them in also remembering that when that separation begins to fall away, it falls away into what is completely whole, all encompassing, and in which there couldn't possibly be any sense of loss at all. I understand their fear, but it's also possible to see that it's not founded on anything that's really solid. That fear is also going to fall away as they progress through that kind of transition. And maybe it's helpful to hear. There's I got to borrow a phrase from, I think this is probably has its source in many different places, but it goes something like that when that individuated sense, that separated sense of self begins to fall away, it can sound as though it's a disavowing of everything else out here. That it's, if I lose that, then I'm sort of utterly and completely lost. And instead, as that begins to fade away, it becomes more possible, more and more possible, not to have that sense of loss, but again, to have the experience of really embracing absolutely everything. And so it sounds paradoxical that I could lose everything but gain everything. and yet it ends up being true. And that's the heart of that particular miracle. That in losing that sense of self, one has the opportunity to embrace everything.
Yeah.
And I suppose in the terms of those cartoon fish, it's recognizing how vast the ocean is. And maybe this conversation today will encourage a few hearty souls that are pointed in that direction.
Well, that's what we're here for, I guess.
Yeah. In my own case, there was a bunch of years of sort of grappling with this, and having this experience repeatedly of sort of like being infused in that peace and feeling I experienced it like a pendulum. There were times when I would feel this just extraordinary peace that was so similar to the kind of peace that I touched in that NDE. And, if you wake up in the morning and there is really just overwhelming sense of peace, there's no sense of lack, want, or need. And it's really hard to feel like there's a good reason to go to the office even.
I heard that one before.
And,
yeah.
Yeah. And it to me, that was confounding it in a way. It was beautiful, but it was confusing all at the same time, because the idea that I should definitely go to the office, had been ground into the rest of my mind, for so long.
Yeah.
And sometimes that pendulum would swing the other way, and I would be like a moment of panic inside, real terror. Like, what am I doing? This is nuts. This is crazy. I have a mortgage. I'm a grown-up with grown-up stuff to do. And, this is nuts. And it really would swing back and forth. And it was like one side of the pendulum would make the other one worse. Like that peace would make that fear seem so absurd. And yet when it would swing into that fear, the fear would be so abject. And so it would make this peace seem like it was so far away and unreachable. And, it was through this whole range of experiences then that eventually I did a weird thing, which was to, by the measures of the world, it's an odd thing to do, in which that the drive to reconcile all of this inside myself had become really so ferocious that it began to seem like it eclipsed everything else I was doing. And I honestly, I began to care less and less. It was like my whole sense of values was changing. Like I cared less and less about the outward things I was doing in life in favor of this is what just seemed more important in trying to reconcile what was going on inside and understand that peace and understand what was happening. And but it seemed incredibly natural to begin to just drop what was going on out there. So I began, my social life shrank. I was running a small business with a business partner, and that's what going to the office meant at the time. And, my involvement in that just felt less and less meaningful, despite the fact that it also continued to put a roof over my head and all the normal things. But it really began to feel like it all was falling apart. And that drive to reconcile what was inside was so strong that I did eventually do this thing where I shut it all down and I disappeared. I sold my car. I said goodbye to the lovely woman I had been with for a few years. I got myself out of this little business and really shut it all down and disappeared. And I sent myself on a little retreat in the highlands of Guatemala, and there was nothing particularly special about it being Guatemala, except that frankly Guatemala is it's a very poor country, and it was so cheap to be there that I could just do it without having to be concerned with that, that particular aspect. I could be there for a while and not have to think about that. And it was really there that it was a solo retreat, essentially, I'd sent myself on. And the task that I set was to dig through my own fear patterns to understand where they came from and what they were and how they got there and what they meant and what they were about. And it was actually through that process of journaling for many, many months that I first wrote down the story of the NDE. And it was an effort on my part to sort of parse through all of the experiences I'd had.
Yeah.
And in doing so, I guess you could say I was doing what a good Zen Buddhist would call self-inquiry, sort of on steroids. And it was in digging through those fear patterns and asking those questions like, what is this? Where did this come from? Why does this operate? How is this operating? I mean, it seems like the fear patterns in my mind are what have ruled it. And it was through this sort of inquiry process of writing my way through all that experience that there came a point in which it just felt like something inside me collapsed. And that experience and that sense of the lack of an individuated sense of self in there having any truth is what sort of ultimately collapsed. And that piece that I had run into first in that NDE, and then many times subsequent to it as well, felt like it sort of flooded in a way that was permanent. And there's a lot to unpack in what I'm saying, I think, but because even though it has felt like that sense of peace and the sense of truth in terms of that lack of an individuated self being true, like I look inside and I know unequivocally it isn't true, even though I operate in the world in a way that kind of makes it look like a thing.
Yeah.
It really is like putting on a costume because that's what works here. But still knowing that fundamentally it isn't really the truth. It's a kind of a costume. And and the peace that's associated with that is there, and also it never really wavers. But I would say this about it: it doesn't mean that there isn't sort of a way in which I go through the ups and downs of life. Life still has slings and arrows. And there's a way in which sometimes that piece is more at the forefront, and sometimes it's more in the background. And sometimes I still cry, and life seems crazy and chaotic, because sometimes life is crazy and chaotic.
You can say that.
Yeah, yeah, it's just that that even the moments of chaos and the moments of tragedy and the moments of all the human things that we go through, I would say that it's just that those kinds of moments are met a little differently than they would have been in the past. It doesn't mean they don't happen, or it doesn't even mean that I would find them particularly pleasant or easy. But they're still met with in a way that I can say is different than it would have been in my own past.
Yeah.
And for that, I'm deeply grateful. And it's really, I could say it's that I sort of end up sharing with others when we work together, when someone comes to me along the course of their own spiritual journey. And yeah, there's a lot to unpack in all of that. I'm sure there is, but
I think you gave us a very good summary, to be honest. So thank you, Jonathan. I really appreciate it. Well, I do have a few other questions for you, if I may.
Sure.
So first of all, if you don't mind, I would love to. So one thing that really stood out for me about your story is when, I can't remember which podcast, but you spoke about your father's passing.
Yes.
And,
Oh, yes.
I feel this is something I really want to discuss, because the level of conviction that you had, I think people can learn a lot from. I mean, you went as far as saying that you were, I think you said that you thrilled for him, even excited on his behalf, because obviously that's not clearly how the majority of human beings live the loss of a loved one. So I was hoping perhaps you could expand on this a little bit, maybe also for those that may be grieving right now, or perhaps, will be at some point, because, let's face it, this is probably the lesson that most of us have to go through sooner or later. So, yeah,
Yes.
I'd love to hear your take on this.
Sure. So Dani's referring to 11 years after my own NDE, which, for the record, I never spoke with my father about.
Oh, wow.
He never, I mean, he was there to take care of me during that, but he never, ever heard stories about merging into the infinite or anything like it. And
may I ask as to why?
I just, during that period of time, I felt like, one, I just didn't have the words to articulate it in the first place in a way that would be in any way understandable for him. I mean, he was a very bright guy, but his life experience was very different.
Okay.
And I reflect on the same question sometimes. I wonder what would have happened if, or something. But 11 years later, my father is in fact dying. And I didn't have a perfect relationship with him for sure, but as grown adults, we had a basically a gentle, loving relationship with each other. And so he's I'm called down to a hospital in Arizona, and he's already in septic shock. He's unconscious. And what I end up experiencing there, I didn't know this was a term until rather recently, was what's in the NDE world is often called a shared death experience.
Yep.
And it took the form of this. So I get to the hospital, first of all, and my stepmother, who's been married to my father for 25 years, and they had a really nice relationship with each other, really beautiful. And she comes into the room bawling her eyes out and says, "Jonathan, I can't do it. You have to do this. You have to deal with this." And I knew instantly what she meant. And what I was being tasked with in that moment was to pull the plug on the machines that were keeping my father alive and let him die. And that was a choice, a responsibility, that I was going to have to be responsible for. And the minute I heard that, I felt, I did feel a moment of, well, I mean, it's an extremely sobering thing to hear, but I immediately leaned into my own past experience. And, when I look back, if I had to say, well, what was one of the, karmic reasons maybe for having the experience that I had had already, was that I instantly knew that I was going to have to lean into that NDE experience of my own on behalf of my father. And I felt like, well, what actually happened in the experience was that I felt like I joined with him on that level of mind. And basically, you could say an energetic level or a soul level, or lots of ways we could put it, but I felt like our consciousness joined, our souls sort of joined together, and it was like saying, "Hey, Dad, I know you're not quite ready, but I'm gonna walk you to the edge." And it was like going with him to the edge of that eternity, to the edge of that vastness, and saying, looking into it, and showing him the way to that threshold. And then sitting on that edge, it was sort of like sitting on the edge of a canyon, or sitting on the edge of, sitting on a tree branch, looking over this vastness, and we just sat there and enjoyed it. And it was actually it was one of the most joyous experiences I'd had as with my father in a very real way to me. And it was like saying, I just wanted to show you the way to where you're going. But that's also the way to the peace that passes understanding. It's a way of walking someone to that place in their own experience in which there cannot be any suffering, that the default setting is something gentle and loving. And I mean, in essence, it was about the most beautiful experience you could possibly share with someone. And knowing that we were going to sit and enjoy this together for a little while, which we did for hours. And I'm at this hospital, and family members are arriving from all over the country, which could take many, many hours. And so it was just like hanging out with them there for hours, and knowing that at some point he was going to take one more step into that vastness, and I was going to stay here. But it was in sharing that threshold with him that was so exquisitely beautiful. And the idea of being faced with having to pull those plugs and let that finally happen, and inescapably, there's a way in which, there's some sense of loss in a way. Like I won't be able to call my dad up on the phone the way I used to. And in that worldly sense, I understand that there's something different. There's a loss, and certainly my family members. None of my family members have any experiences of their own that I'm aware of that could inform the situation in the same way that I'd had. And so I knew from the beginning, like in all of my family, I'm the one that's sort of most qualified, in a weird way for this task.
Yeah.
And so, so it became a choice not of difficulty in the sense of tragedy and loss and all of that. It's more like, well, if you're looking at somebody you love and you want something, beautiful for them, it's in that sense, like I feel thrilled to be able to share this with my father. I feel thrilled to be able to walk to the edge of that eternity with him, and to share the most beautiful experience he's ever had, and to revel in that with him, and know that the next step for him is going to be even more all-encompassing. And there's something about that that's just so beautiful, that it's a funny thing to say in some ways, but how could I not be thrilled on his behalf? Mm-hmm. To know and to share for even a moment in some of the greatest peace and the most beautiful experience that he's going to have or could possibly have. Like there's something in that that's truly joyous. And it's with that in mind that by the time I wait for all the family members that are coming to come, and we stand around his bedside, we're all together, and I give the order, and there's machines, there's heart rate, and there's oxygen levels, and there's all these things beeping, and and we immediately see all those signs begin to dissipate, and that is in fact my father's departure. And there were lots of tears all around, including falling down my own face. But that knowing that he was going into the most beautiful experience he could possibly go into with the greatest freedom possible and the greatest love made it genuinely and sincerely possible to let him go from this dimension in a way that was deeply peaceful on my behalf. I mean to say it that way, not because there wasn't still some sense of grief in it. That's only human. I mean, I still have this is still a human form. There was some sense of grief, but that was sort of surrounded by a sense of peace about it that was still quite encompassing and made it really, really okay to feel. So, and since that time, I've been in the company of other people that are dying, and I've seen and experienced other similar things. I can understand easily the sense of grief and sense of loss that people have about their family member leaving. But I would hasten to add that there is in fact more to the story also.
Yeah.
And that is good news.
That's good. The best news we could possibly get.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan. That's brilliant.
Sure.
So I'll be curious to know, what do you think if there's anything that people who have not had a near-death experience can do to start to come to terms with the notion of a life after death?
And the thing is, to me, it's impossible for me to look at literally anyone and not recognize on some level that truth and that awareness is in them. It's just a matter of how they're going to come to it. And NDE is one of a zillion different ways. An NDE is not required. I've often had people say, I've often had people say, gosh, I really wish I had an NDE. Yeah. And I'd be like, wait a minute, are you sure about that? Do you remember the part about the mind-bending pain and the, all the horrible things that people have sometimes experienced to get to that point in the first place? Are you sure you want to go down that road?
Probably not.
There are many, many different pathways. That is only one of them. And it's not even particularly special in my point of view. It's just one of the many different ways. And I'm so delighted that even, these human minds that we carry around with us are in fact capable of learning from other people's experiences without having to go through the same experience. So,
and I can attest to that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm one of them. Yeah.
Yeah, amen. Amen, brother. Here's the thing. Having an NDE or any one of a number of so many other kinds of spiritual experiences, I put quotes around it because what is a spiritual experience other than a human experience? This is the human journey we're on. Yeah. The word spiritual is kind of silly, frankly. If you're a human, well, here we are, and we're in it together. And what's at the heart of my own experience, really, one way of describing it is that there's a way in which it put me in touch with some kind of sense of lovingness that was quite all-encompassing. And so many of these other NDEs, but so many other kinds of experiences people undergo have that capacity. And what I want to point out is that even though some of these NDE experiences sound kind of outrageous, or unique, let's be clear that there is no one on this planet that has themselves not experienced in some way something that was loving. And I grant that there have been some miserable experiences on this planet, but even the most miserable of those have encountered some kind of love in some form at some point along that journey. And it's in that way that we are not different. If you have experienced any kind of lovingness coming to you or from you in any way whatsoever, then you have in fact already touched what is at the deepest heart of my experience, at the deepest heart of countless other experiences. You're more connected to this than you've probably given yourself credit for. In terms of how to be more in touch with such things, I'm a huge fan of a little stillness and a little silence. And that's not a particularly new or original idea. That's been cooking, in the story of mankind for millennia. But it's still one of my favorites. And it's, the reason is that it's when we approach a little stillness and a little silence that we open the possibility for us a little more and a little more to take what I have long considered or thought of as this backward step that sort of takes us, opens the opportunity for us to look past the busy machinations of the sort of egoic frame of reference and begin to recognize whether it comes in some mind-bending experience or not, there still is this opportunity for our mind to begin to recognize, wait, there's more to the story. And that is enough. When the mind cracks open just that much, wait, I think there might be more to the story. I might not understand it entirely, but it's that tiny adjustment in the course. It's that sensitive dependence on that initial condition. It's that tiny adjustment at the beginning that then begins to make a radical difference down the road and brings us a little closer and a little closer and a little closer to a little bit greater understanding, but also, and perhaps more importantly, a little bit more experiential, a greater experience. That it's when we begin to recognize there's more to this story and become even slightly oriented towards it, that we begin to bring to ourselves the kinds of experiences that are going to show that greater story might have truth. It's going to bring to us the experiences that we need individually. Everyone is different. Every single person is going to have a slightly different experience. I would never, ever wish for someone to have the same experience as I. Never. I would wish that they bring themselves closer to the particularly unique experience that it is going to speak to them in the loudest terms, in the terms that they can hear and understand. And that's going to be slightly different than the experiences I needed.
What would you say is the biggest lesson that you've learned from your NDE?
In this particular moment, I'm finding it hard to say without sounding almost a little over poetic, but in the end, love really is all there is. And the more we cozy up to that truth with a capital T, the more all the other things naturally begin to fall away. I think I'll just leave it at that for the moment.
Yeah, I think there's nothing else needs to be added, to be honest. Why do you think we're here on Earth then?
Oh, I think that's a very interesting question. There's a lot of ways I feel like I could put it how I sort of see it. One way of putting it is that it's a venue that we've put ourselves in to learn that, in fact, love is all there is. It's why it's in many spiritual traditions, it's noted that the world has an illusory quality to it. in some fashion, that it's a dream, it's an illusion, it's a projection. And what's true about what is a dream or an illusion is that it doesn't have fundamental truth. It doesn't have fundamental reality to it. And that's why when we say love is all there is, then what's remarkable about that is that it means then nothing else really is. And so if it appears as though there is other, that is an illusion.
What is God for you?
God is just is the awareness of that sort of overwhelming wholeness, and I don't know how else to put it than that.
It's a safe answer, to be honest. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I have one last question for you, my friend. What is the meaning of life for you?
Oh, the meaning of life.
That's how I like to end these conversations. Yes, please. Take it away.
Oh, that's another one that I feel like I could wrap many words around in a way, but my favorite way of thinking about that at the moment is that the meaning of life is embodied in listening to that inner guidance that's cut from that divine source. And it's in doing so that brings the experiences that shows that that divine source is all there is, and simultaneously kind of shows the way while you at least appear to be here. And so what meaning we find in life here reveals itself most fully when we're following the prompt of that inner divine guidance as our sole direction finding source.
Jonathan, thank you so much. We had well, what a wonderful conversation. I think you did unpack a lot of pearls of wisdom, if we may call it that way, with the little time that we had available. And yeah, wishing all the best. Thank you for all the work that you're doing, and bye for now.
Bye for now, my friend.
All right,
I look forward to it again. We'll do it another time in some way or another.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
It's been a total joy, and I'll look forward to it.
All the
Thank
best
you,
for
man.
now. Ta-ta. All right. Oh, hi there. Well, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video and want to support the IANDS community, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and maybe share with the ones you love. If you're looking for another video to watch, I think this could be a very good one. New episodes out every Friday, and until then, enjoy the stream we all call live, and live the love you wish to see in the world. Bye for now.